If you're tired of these promos, supporters get the podcast early and ad-free. Just go to donate.bogosity.tv for the links to sign up. Welcome to the Bogosity Podcast for the week of March 24, 2024, the podcast that's born in the Carolinas. This is your host, Shane Killian. Next week is the 5th weekend in the month, and that means no podcast, but for now, let's texturize the news of the bogus. So, we know there's inflation, and we know it's a lot bigger than the government's been telling us. Now, a new working paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research has formally verified that, quote, the lows in U.S. consumer sentiment that cannot be explained by unemployment and official inflation are strongly correlated with borrowing costs and consumer credit supply. Concerns over borrowing costs, which have historically tracked the cost of money, are at their highest levels since the Volcker era. We then develop alternative measures of inflation that include borrowing costs and can account for almost 3/4 of the gap in U.S. consumer sentiment in 2023. Global evidence shows the consumer sentiment gaps across countries are also strongly correlated with changes in interest rates. It's kind of amazing, really. The paper begins with the words, "The economy is booming, and everyone knows it, except for the American people." One of the paper's authors is Larry Summers, a Harvard professor and president emeritus, and Treasury Secretary to Bill Clinton, as well as director of Barack Obama's National Economic Council. He's no conservative, no MAGA flunky or anything like that. He is establishment left. He took to X to explain the findings of the paper, explaining why, quote, since Arthur Okun invented his misery index in the 1970s, economists have looked at unemployment and the inflation rate to gauge consumer sentiment. But now that unemployment is low and inflation has declined, consumer sentiment remains depressed. He shows a graph from the paper showing that the expected rise in consumer sentiment didn't happen. In fact, it dropped below its lowest point since the 1970s. Likewise, consumer concerns over borrowing are the highest they've been since the Volcker era. The paper says, quote, in this paper, we present a more concrete explanation for this divergence, the cost of money. Consumers, unlike modern economists, consider the cost of money part of their cost of living. Interest rates have reached 20-year highs in the wake of the pandemic. With higher rates, mortgage payments, car payments, and other credit payments required to finance everyday purchases have risen as well. Amid higher credit costs, banks' willingness to supply consumer credit has fallen to depths similar to the COVID and Great Financial Crises. Home prices are up almost 50% since the start of the pandemic, while the 30-year mortgage rate has tripled since the historic lows of 2021. Given that home prices remain at historic highs despite higher interest rates, the interest payment on a new 30-year mortgage for the average house has increased more than threefold since 2021. The interest payment on a new car loan has increased more than 80% since the start of the pandemic. It is not surprising that this would affect how consumers feel about the economy. These increases in the cost of living do not make it into economists' measures of inflation, however. The CPI excludes interest payments and is up a relatively muted 20% since the end of 2019. This was not always the case. When Okun created his index, the measurement procedure for the CPI included measures of interest costs. This changed with the CPI redesign of 1983. And it's a change that has a huge effect on how economists understand the cost of living, quote. This paper argues that this disconnect in inflation measurement on the one hand and actual increases in the cost of living due to higher financing costs faced by consumers on the other underpins the recent divergence between official inflation data and consumer sentiment. So, the author said about reconstructing the data using CPI the way it was calculated back when Okun first made his observations. Prior to this paper, many libertarians, Austrian economists, and others were pointing out that the new figures made inflation appear much lower than it really is. These claims have been poo-pooed by mainstream politicians, economists, and the news media. But now, when Summers and his co-authors reconstructed it, they showed that they were able to account for 70% of the gap in consumer sentiment. And in the process, the paper found, quote, "This measure produces estimates suggesting that headline CPI would have peaked at 18% in November 2022 when consumer sentiment was at its lows." This was when Okun's misery index using the measurement procedure from his time would have peaked at 21.6%. Alternative CPI inflation would still have stood above 12% in August and 8% in November 2023. The pre-1983 measure still offers a more worrying picture of inflation in the current moment than the official inflation numbers. Below, we will argue that it does much to explain depressed sentiment over the last 2 years. Summers gave a summary of that finding on X, saying, quote, "We show that if we make an effort to reconstruct the CPI of Okun's era, which would have had inflation peak last year around 18%, we are able to explain 70% of the gap in consumer sentiment we saw last year." So, this is Larry Summers openly admitting that, were it not for the metric change, if we calculated inflation the same way we did in the 70s, it would have peaked at 18% in late 2022. As far as I know, this is the first time any economist or policymaker in the establishment has ever admitted such a thing. The paper concluded, "This paper shows that the current gap is not unique to the United States or this cycle. Consumers are digesting economic data in a way that is consistent with consumer sentiment during previous bursts of high inflation and increasing interest rates. The inclusion of borrowing costs into an alternative measure of CPI inflation significantly narrows the gap between predicted and actual consumer sentiment. Cross-country evidence confirms that consumers around the world care more about the cost of money. As with so many models calibrated on post-1980 data, a period that saw little variance in inflation and changes in interest rates, the misery index relationship appears to have broken down following the first post-Volcker jump in inflation and interest rates." The paper speculates on how economists should go from here, but here's a modest suggestion from your humble host. Maybe listen to the people who have been right all along? If you're looking for a way to support this channel, but you don't have any spare cash and you can't stand ads, you can do so by generating your own cryptocurrency. Use the links at the bottom of the description to follow the link to Odysee.com to listen to the podcast and see all of my YouTube videos as well. Just watching videos will produce cryptocurrency for the creator and yourself. And since Odysee is always monetized and never censored, you'll have no problem seeing all the videos from your favorite creators. You can also use the library credits you created Odysee to tip creators and even purchase paid content. Earn library credits through various rewards, including daily view rewards and the number of shares and invites. And you can interact with creators in all sorts of ways, including like and dislike, comment, boost a post by supporting it, repost it, and share to other sites, all while earning crypto for the creator. Easily monetize yourself and your favorite creators using cryptocurrency without advertising. Use the link below to visit this channel on Odysee.com and see many of your other favorites there as well. It looks like the Craig Wright saga has finally and mercifully come to an end. He's the scam artist who spent years trying to convince everyone that he was the one and only Satoshi Nakamoto, creator of Bitcoin and author of the 2008 white paper that first proposed it. We've debunked his claims on this podcast before. If he really were Satoshi, he could have easily proven it. Satoshi has a known PGP key that he used to sign his messages. Wright could have just signed a message to the world using that. Or he could have signed a message with the keys used to create the Genesis block, or any other wallets known to be Satoshi's. It would be trivial for the real Satoshi to prove it to the world in mere seconds in ways that no reasonable person could doubt. Instead, Wright resorted to methods used by scam artists and ultimately the court system. This included making a copyright claim on the white paper and trying to patent Bitcoin's open source code. The non-profit Crypto Open Patent Alliance presented their arguments in a UK court that Wright is not Satoshi, a claim he's been making since 2016. Backed by Coinbase and other big players in the crypto industry, they showed evidence that Wright forged evidence and didn't have the knowledge or expertise to create Bitcoin. They showed, among other things, that Wright insisted the paper was produced in LaTeX and produced forged documents to try and show it when it was written in OpenOffice, claimed that the white paper was first hosted on his site in Melbourne when it was a free file hosting site in Dubai, claimed that the initial mining of Bitcoin took 70 computers and cost $11,000 a month to run when it only ran on a few machines, didn't even realize there was a public key associated with the Genesis block, and couldn't even speak with any knowledge about the original Bitcoin code. He spent the first few years not even spelling Bitcoin correctly. This isn't the only case in the UK courts. There's also one Wright filed against Coinbase, BTC Core, and others, claiming database rights over the Bitcoin blockchain and file format. Another, also against Coinbase as well as Kraken, alleges that what they're selling isn't real Bitcoin and they're violating his intellectual property. While this has been going on, Wright has amassed quite a following online of people who believe he's the real Satoshi, drawing people away from other projects and causing multiple fractures in the Bitcoin world. Now, Judge James Mellor has ruled that the evidence is overwhelming that Wright is not Satoshi. Quote, "The evidence is overwhelming. First, that Dr. Wright is not the author of the Bitcoin white paper. Second, Dr. Wright is not the person who adopted or operated under the pseudonym Satoshi Nakamoto in the period 2008 to 2011. Third, Dr. Wright is not the person who created the Bitcoin system. And fourth, he is not the author of the initial versions of the Bitcoin software." Wired said that the ruling was surprising, but it wasn't to those of us who've looked at the issue logically. Additionally, not when you consider that Wright lied in open court, including fabricating an email between himself and his previous legal counsel. A COPA spokesperson said, quote, "This decision is a win for developers, for the entire open source community, and for the truth. For over 8 years, Dr. Wright and his financial backers have lied about his identity as Satoshi Nakamoto and used that lie to bully and intimidate developers in the Bitcoin community. That ends today with the court's ruling that Craig Wright is not Satoshi Nakamoto." If you're wondering what Wright's counsel, Lord Anthony Grabiner, could possibly have said in response to all this, he pathetically argued that the ruling, get this, violates Wright's freedom of speech. But you don't have freedom of speech to commit fraud. You don't have freedom of speech to commit perjury. Another desperate claim was that if Wright isn't Satoshi, the real Satoshi should be required to unmask himself definitively. Basically, will the real Slim Shady please stand up? Which, if nothing else, will be difficult for Satoshi to do if he's dead, as more than one of the people speculated to be Satoshi have passed on. There's also the question of, how would you make him do such a thing if nobody knows who he is? Hopefully, the chilling effect this is having on Bitcoin developers is now over, and most of Wright's cult quickly abandoned him. But it's still not clear what he'll do next, and from a man who's been shown to have basically no scruples whatsoever, that's a pretty scary thought. If you're on the Wi-Fi in a coffee shop or hotel, anyone on that network can get your traffic. Do you really trust all of those strangers? For that matter, do you really trust your ISP? A VPN can protect you from prying eyes, disguise your location, and even foil government censors. It's essential in this day and age, so go to vpn.pagacity.tv and you'll be taken to BoxPN. Starting at just $2.99 a month, you can get unlimited high-speed connections to VPN servers all over the world, and they don't log connections, so your privacy is assured. Traveling abroad, just VPN home, and don't worry about what those other governments are doing. Back at home, stop your ISP from traffic shaping and messing with the quality internet access you're paying good money for. You can connect from multiple machines at once, including your smartphone or tablet, and it supports all the secure standards, including OpenVPN and SSTP. Bypass censors and surveillance with your own secure VPN connection. Go to vpn.pagacity.tv. My teenage years were during the 80s, and during that period of time there were all these televangelists who were screeching about all these horrible people who had sex and did drugs and were gay and everything. And it turned out they were the ones having sex with gay prostitutes and doing drugs and scamming people. Today I'm getting deja vu all over again, only this time with prominent prosecutors, especially those on the left. We covered just some of the incredible scandals with Fulton County DA Fani Willis. Now, it turns out that New York AG Letitia James has been involved in exactly the kind of scam she accused Trump of. An expose from Miranda Devine shows James's involvement in financial wrongdoing with the American Irish Historical Society, which owns a mansion right across from Central Park and the Met. When the society fell on hard times, they turned to Georgia businessman James Doyle for a $3 million loan. He was told that the mansion was worth $80 million. The society found themselves unable to pay back the loan, so in 2021 they tried to sell the building for $52 million, which later got dropped to $44 million. That was when Letitia James stepped in. She said that any sale of a nonprofit asset had to be approved by her. She said, quote, "It's an amazing place. We had to save it. One day people can come in there and enjoy it again." But they still owed the $3 million. So she appointed an interim board of directors, offering Doyle a seat in exchange for him agreeing not to collect on the mortgage before July 2023. Come August 2023, he still hadn't been paid, so he initiated foreclosure proceedings. James then blocked him, claiming the mortgage was invalid because he was a board member. See the scam? By the way, the only restriction that exists is a board member loaning money to another board member. Nothing against loaning money to the charity itself. So Doyle sued the society and requested a subpoena against James, requiring her to produce documents which included anything related to campaign events hosted at the townhouse or any contributions to her political campaigns from the society or its members or directors. Doyle's lawyer, Tim Parlatore, pointed out numerous similarities between this case and James's case against Trump, although now she's on the other end of things. Doyle was, in fact, given fraudulently inflated valuations of the townhouse when they claimed it was worth over $80 million. They also represented that the building had air rights and could be built or rebuilt above its current height. Quote, "In reality, there were no air rights, and the actual value is closer to $20 million. This organization fraudulently inflated the value of their building to induce my client into giving them a mortgage, which Tish James is now trying to help these fraudsters avoid having to repay. The theory of fraud Tish James accused the Trump organization of engaging in is identical to the fraud she is aiding and abetting here." And one important difference is, in Trump's case, the banks could do their own sophisticated due diligence, as Trump's own documents suggested they do. Deutsche Bank took the stand to say that this was done, they were happy with the loans, they were paid back, and all is well. Whereas in this case, Doyle couldn't do that. He's not a bank, just a guy, so he had to rely on their statements, which, unlike Trump, they insisted were correct. And as the lender, he is not happy, and the loans have not been paid back. Parlatore said, quote, Tish James said, "Nobody is above the law," which should include Tish James, who seems to have actively aided and abetted in the art of the steal. I looked, and sadly I couldn't find anywhere else where the mainstream media was reporting this. They were all salivating over James's attempts to seize Trump's properties, which should be put on hold while the appeal process is ongoing. But this is something the voters of New York should definitely be aware of. We'll see what happens as the suit progresses. Do you have children, or nieces or nephews? Are you homeschooling, or just want to counter some of the socialist indoctrination most children get in school? If so, go to bogosity.tv/TuttleTwins, and you'll be taken to a website where you can get some great books for elementary-age children. The Tuttle Twins books are books about liberty and free market economics that include children's versions of Bastiat's The Law, Leonard Read's I, Pencil, and Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, as well as books about the Federal Reserve and how regulations protect business cronies. They'll learn about the harm caused by eminent domain, or regulations passed in the name of safety, and fundamental concepts of liberty. And as you can see from the sample pages on the website, they're all easy to read and nicely illustrated. They're just $9.99 a piece, or get a special discount as well as free bonuses when you purchase all 5. You can even buy in bulk to donate to schools and local libraries. So get the Tuttle Twins books at bogosity.tv/TuttleTwins. And now it's time to interpenetrate this week's biggest bogon emitter. And this week it goes to the Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, Explosives, heck with it, the ATF. You know who I mean. One of their agents recently and spontaneously blocked the sale of a gun to a Florida man. Check this out. The agent was just there doing a routine audit. Remember, the ATF is a tax organization. They operate under the Department of the Treasury. A random guy was in there to pick up a 9mm Beretta APX he had previously ordered. After having going through all the background checks and filling out all the forms and all that, it had been done, approved, and he was just there to pick it up. The agent then blocked the sale because, what do we keep hearing? I smell marijuana! The Florida man, known only as Daniel to protect his privacy, had already completed ATF Form 4473, the one where you have to say you are not, quote, an unlawful user of or addicted to marijuana or any depressant, stimulant, narcotic drug, or any other controlled substance. You know, the one that Hunter Biden blatantly violated. There are all sorts of reasons why one might smell like marijuana without actually having done any. You could have been around a friend or family member who was smoking, or had just recently smoked, or even a total stranger. A couple of months ago, my wife and I were at the dump, and a pickup pulled up beside us. The guy who got out smelled of absolutely the worst skunk I never even knew was possible. All he did was walk by us, and the smell of it was still in our clothes when we got home. We had to immediately throw them in the laundry hamper. And it occurred to me that if we'd gotten stopped on the way home, even by a simple license check, the officer could, completely truthfully, have said he smelled marijuana and used that as a pretext to search our car. And that's in a state where marijuana is completely illegal, but Florida has been a medical marijuana state since 2016 and has more than 830,000 medical cannabis users. So although it's still against the law federally, it's entirely possible to be exposed to marijuana smoke perfectly legally. In addition, there are, for some reason I'll never understand, marijuana-scented candles, incense, sprays, air fresheners, colognes, perfumes, and essential oils. Any one of these can leave an odor. You can get any of these from Amazon and hundreds of other places. Why you would want to is a complete mystery, but they're there and people buy them. ATF industry operations investigators are not law enforcement officers. They're just regulators. As such, they don't have any training in things like what marijuana smells like, which raises the question, how does he know what marijuana smells like? Did he effectively admit to committing a federal crime? In addition, they aren't trained to recognize the symptoms of anyone who's under the influence or anything else that would give him reasonable, articulable suspicion. The Second Amendment Foundation reached out to the ATF's Tampa spokesman Jason Medina for answers, and basically got none. They asked under what circumstances can an IOI stop a gun transfer, and were just told it was a good question. When asked whether or not the IOI's actions were within ATF's policies and procedures, they were told that someone would get back to them on Friday. Close of business that Friday, they hadn't talked to anyone else who could discuss the case, but not for lack of trying. The IOI's boss, Aaron Gerber, the Director of Industry Operation for ATF's Tampa field office, declined to respond to any of their calls, texts, or emails. Daniel said he didn't use marijuana on his 4473, a statement made under penalty of perjury. Absent evidence to the contrary, that should have been good enough. A document, especially a sworn statement, is considered truth unless you have evidence to contradict it. And a smell from a completely unqualified person just isn't good enough. Not by a long shot. But this is how the ATF operates. They will find any excuse to deny someone their gun rights and then hide from any accountability, scrutiny, or consequences. Insert my usual spiel here. End the ATF, end the war on drugs, and end everything now that I think about it. So all of that makes the ATF this week's biggest bogon emitter. I want to tell you about the eyeglasses I've been wearing for years. As people can see on my videos, I have a very strong prescription, which makes glasses more expensive, especially when I need computer glasses, reading glasses, prescription sunglasses, and most expensively, progressive lenses for general everyday wear. To save money while still getting quality glasses, I get them from Firmoo. In fact, I just got a pair of progressives with high-index aspherical lenses and a nice pair of frames my wife loves for just over $100. It would have been $500 to get them through my eye doctor. Not only do they look good, the glasses are durable. I've worn many pairs for several years without problems. All orders come with a 30-day return policy, a 3-month warranty, and one-on-one customer service. Go to Firmoo, that's FIRMOO.Bogosity.tv anytime you need quality glasses at a low price. Once again, that's Firmoo.Bogosity.tv. And now let's re-indoctrinate this week's Idiot Extraordinaire. And yet again, it's the news media, which, if anything, seems to be getting more and more desperate to support their political agenda, not by promoting it or arguing for it, but for tearing down other people any way they can. And again, this is about Republican presidential candidate and former President Donald Trump regarding his comments at a car rally in Vandalia, Ohio. They did their usual creationist-level quote mining, so we'll start off with the full context of his comments so you can hear what he actually said.
Mexico has taken, over a period of 30 years, 34% of the automobile manufacturing business in our country. Think of it. Went to Mexico. China now is building a couple of massive plants where they're going to build the cars in Mexico and they think that they're going to sell those cars into the United States with no tax at the border. Let me tell you something to China. If you're listening, President Xi, and you and I are friends, but he understands the way I deal, those big monster car manufacturing plants that you're building in Mexico right now, and you think you're going to get that, you're going to not hire Americans, and you're going to sell the cars to us now, we're going to put a 100% tariff on every single car that comes across the line, and you're not going to be able to sell those cars. If I get elected, now if I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath for the whole, that's going to be the least of it. It's going to be a bloodbath for the country. That'll be the least of it.
Now, agree with him or not, and I don't, it's absolutely clear what he said. If China opens car factories in Mexico, it'll be a bloodbath, clearly speaking in the economic sense of the term in the U.S. car market. And the only way to avoid that is to elect him for a second term. Midas Touch posted on X, Trump, now if I don't get elected, it's gonna be a bloodbath. It's gonna be a bloodbath for the country. Posting only that tiny clip. Mark Elias shared that tiny clip on X and posted, the next wave of Republican attacks on our elections is coming. In fact, it may have already begun. We know it will be ruthless and shameless. Trump is admitting it will also be violent. Keith Olbermann, Rachel Maddow, all sorts of commentators on MSNBC and CNN, ABC, CBS, Politico, NPR, Rolling Stone, the LA Times, The View, so many others did the same thing, trying to make it sound like Trump was threatening violence if he loses. The New York Times even said, quote, Trump says some migrants are not people and predicts a bloodbath if he loses. Rule of thumb, if you're only seeing a 9-second clip of something that's supposed to outrage you, you're almost certainly being lied to. Merriam-Webster's definition 2B of bloodbath is a major economic disaster, which is unmistakably how Trump was using the word. Dictionary.com's definition 2 is a period of disastrous loss or reversal. Wiktionary's definition 5 is a large financial loss or massive layoff brought about by negative economic conditions. This is an often used, well-worn economic term. It was used constantly through 2008. Politicians kept saying it through the teens and the COVID years, so they know this. As Lily Tomlin said, no matter how cynical you get, it's hard to keep up. And a Biden-Harris campaign statement did a lot more than just quote mine. It made up extra stuff that he never said. Quote, tonight, Donald Trump said there would be a bloodbath if he wasn't elected, and that if he lost, there would be no more elections. After opening the general election by meeting with authoritarian leaders and rallying alongside conspiracy theorists, Donald Trump continues to praise dictators, promise to pardon political violence, and launch racist attacks against black and brown Americans. It's why last night, Trump's own former Vice President Mike Pence, who Trump supporters called to hang for not overturning the election, came out against Trump. This is who Donald Trump is, a loser who gets beat by over 7 million votes, and then instead of appealing to a wider mainstream audience, doubles down on his threats of political violence. He wants another January 6th, but the American people are going to give him another electoral defeat this November because they continue to reject his extremism, his affection for violence, and his thirst for revenge. And for all the screeching the left does about election misinformation on Twitter, they seem to be perfectly fine with all of this. So that makes the news media this week's Idiot Extraordinaire. Well, that wraps up this How Come Burbled Gets to Be in the Oxford English Dictionary but Tugly Doesn't edition of the Bogosity Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please go to donate.bogosity.tv for several ways to support and discord.bogosity.tv to join the discussion. Subscribe at Patreon or Subscribestar, and you can listen early and ad-free. Thank you for listening. Remember, no podcast next week, so we'll see you in 2 weeks. Until then, here's a quote from Mark Isaac. It is extremely easy to find out-of-context quotes that do damage to a person's main ideas, even unintentionally. Quotes should probably be regarded with more skepticism than any other references. The Bogosity Podcast is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. Bogosity.